In the summer of 1881, a man named Thomas Marquette rode into the Crow Agency in the Montana Territory with a notebook, a commission from the Bureau of American Ethnology, and what he later described as a naive confidence that the people he was going to interview would tell him what they knew. Marquette was not a young man by that point. He was 43, a former school teacher from Ohio who had spent a decade working as a field correspondent for the Bureau, transcribing oral traditions, cataloging material culture, sitting in camps and lodges for months at a time, building the slow trust that professional ethnography required. He had done this work in Kansas, in Nebraska, in the Dakota Territories. He thought he understood the pace of it. He was not prepared for what the Crow elders did, which was not to refuse him exactly, but to answer every question he asked about everything except one subject, and to make it clear, through the specific quality of their silence around that subject, that the silence itself was a communication. I found Marquette the way I find most things, not by looking for him, but by running into a gap someone else left behind. I was working through a collection of late 19th century Bureau of American Ethnology correspondence housed at the National Anthropological Archives in Suitland, Maryland, reading through the field reports of a half-dozen ethnographers who had worked with the Plains Nations in the 1870s and 1880s, when I noticed that Marquette's file was substantially thinner than it should have been. He had submitted quarterly reports from the field. I could see the references to them in the Bureau's internal ledger, but the reports themselves were missing. Not all of them. The early ones were there. The ones from his first months in Montana, before winter, when he was still cataloging material culture and kinship structures, and the standard categories the Bureau used to organize its knowledge of indigenous peoples. But the reports from the second winter and the spring of 1882 were gone. The ledger noted their receipt. The file did not contain them. By the time this reaches you, you will understand what Marquette eventually wrote down about the Wyoming stone vaults, why he spent the better part of a year deciding whether to write it at all, and why the thing that finally opened the elders' silence was not his patience or his credentials or his reputation, but a specific question he had not known to ask until an elder asked it for him. Consider the landscape first, because it matters in ways that took me a long time to understand. The Bighorn Basin in north-central Wyoming is bounded on three sides by mountain ranges. The Bighorn Mountains to the east, the Absaroka Range to the west, the Owl Creek Mountains to the south, and its floor is one of the more geologically complex surfaces in the American West. The rock formations visible throughout the basin include exposed sandstone, limestone, and ancient granite in configurations that have been worked by wind, water, and extreme temperature variance across thousands of years into shapes that can be genuinely difficult to distinguish from constructed architecture. This matters because it is the first thing skeptics say about the stone structures that have been documented in the Bighorn Basin since the early survey expeditions of the 1870s. They are natural formations. They are geological. The stone walls and enclosures observed by survey crews are the product of erosion and differential weathering, not of human hands. And for some of what surveyors documented, that argument holds. It does not hold for all of it. There is a survey report filed in July of 1877 by a lieutenant named George Dorsey, assigned to the Hayden Survey's geological reconnaissance of the Bighorn Basin, that I have spent considerable time with. Dorsey was a practical man. His descriptions of geological formations are precise and professional, and in the early sections of his report he is appropriately skeptical of anything that might be mistaken for human construction. But midway through the report, in a section describing the eastern foothills of the Bighorn Mountains, his language changes. He describes a series of structures. He uses that word, structures, not formations, set into the limestone hillside at intervals he measured as consistent, roughly 60 feet apart, running along a ridgeline for approximately 300 yards. The structures were built against the existing rock face, using cut stone fitted without mortar in a manner he described as competent, a specific and deliberate choice of word for a geologist, and each contained an interior space sealed by a stone slab that required, by his estimate, 3 men to move. He and his crew moved one. Inside they found nothing, he notes this explicitly, but the interior surfaces showed evidence of burning at some point in the structure's history, and the floor had been deliberately leveled with packed clay. He counted 11 structures on that ridgeline. He noted the coordinates. And then he filed his report and, as far as the documentary record shows, never returned to the site and never published a word about what he had found. This is the part I keep returning to. 11 sealed stone chambers, built against a natural limestone face, on a ridgeline in the Bighorn foothills, documented by a professional geologist employed by a federal survey mission in 1877. That is not a rumor. That is a filed government document. And when I traced Dorsey's career forward from that point, I found something that I cannot explain in purely coincidental terms. Within 6 months of filing that report, Dorsey had requested and received a reassignment away from the Wyoming Geological Surveys to a desk position in Washington. He did not return to fieldwork for 4 years. He gave no public explanation for the transfer. His personnel file, which I was able to review through a Freedom of Information request, contains a notation from a supervisor referencing a private conversation in which Dorsey expressed concerns about the appropriate scope of the survey mission's mandate. That phrase, the appropriate scope of the survey mission's mandate, appears once and is not elaborated, because 4 years after Dorsey filed his report, Thomas Marquette arrived at the Crow Agency and began asking questions. The Crow people, the Apsaluk, had occupied the Bighorn Basin and the surrounding territories for centuries. Their relationship to that landscape was not peripheral or recent. The Bighorn Mountains were, and remain, sacred to them in a manner that is not metaphorical, but geographic. Specific places, specific formations, specific water sources carry meanings that are encoded in ceremonial knowledge particular to certain families and clans. Marquette understood this in the abstract. What he did not understand, at first, was the degree to which the knowledge surrounding the stone structures in the foothills was not distributed across Crow society, but held by a very specific subset of it. The elders who deflected his questions were not all elders. They were specifically the elders who held keeper roles, a category of responsibility that Marquette took several months to fully understand, because it did not map cleanly onto the categories the Bureau used for religious or ceremonial authority. Keeper, in the Crow context he was working in, referred to someone entrusted with the physical maintenance and the oral knowledge associated with a specific place or object or set of practices. The keepers of the stone structures, and the elders, by their behavior, confirmed that such keepers existed, even as they declined to name them or describe their role in detail, were a separate line of authority from the chiefs, from the medicine keepers, from the elders who spoke freely to Marquette about history and ceremony and cosmology. They were a class apart, and they did not speak to outside researchers. That was apparently not a recent policy. It was, as far as Marquette could determine through indirect questioning, the policy as long as the role had existed. What changed in the spring of 1882, what finally produced the conversation Marquette had been waiting for across nearly a year of quiet persistence, was an illness. Not the epidemic illnesses that had devastated the Plains nations across the preceding decades, though those were ongoing and their effects on the Crow were visible and acute. This was the illness of one specific keeper, an elder whose Crow name Marquette renders phonetically in his notes as something he translates, tentatively, as the one who watches the closed places. That man was dying. And in the way that dying sometimes loosens the hold of long-held silences, he sent word to Marquette that he would speak with him once, in the presence of 2 witnesses of his own choosing, under conditions that Marquette agreed to in writing. Conditions that included a prohibition on publishing what he was told until a period of not less than 10 years had passed, and a requirement that if he published, he would describe the location of the structures only in terms that would not allow their physical identification by someone unfamiliar with the landscape. Marquette agreed. He honored the agreement completely, as far as I can determine. The account he eventually published, in 1893, 11 years after the conversation, just past the minimum period, is one of the most carefully constructed pieces of deliberate omission I have ever read. It describes the conversation. It describes the keeper's role, the lineage of that role stretching back through named predecessors across more generations than Marquette could verify. It describes the keeper's understanding of the structure's purpose, and it describes the structures themselves in language so rigorously stripped of geographic specificity that a reader who did not already know where they were would have no way to find them. Marquette had kept his word to the letter, and had also, I believe, understood that he was producing a document that would be read by people with institutional interests in the Bighorn Basin, and that those people would be better served by not knowing. There is a passage in the 1893 account where Marquette reflects on his own position. He writes that he had come to the Crow as a recorder, as someone whose function was to take what was said and preserve it in a form the institution he worked for could use. He writes that the keeper's conditions had forced him to consider, perhaps for the first time with real seriousness, what it means to preserve something in a form that cannot be used, that renders the knowledge inert for anyone who wants to exploit it, while leaving it legible for anyone willing to sit with it long enough to understand what is being withheld and why. He describes this as a more honest form of record than anything else he had produced in a decade of fieldwork. I have read a great many 19th century ethnographic accounts, and I have never read another one that contains that kind of self-awareness about the institutional machinery the author was serving. Marquette understood what he had been asked to carry. He carried it accordingly. What the keeper told him, in that single conversation attended by 2 witnesses in the spring of 1882, is this: the stone chambers, he did not contest their existence or their construction. He confirmed both, and confirmed that they had been built over a period of time he described as longer than any living person's memory extended, were not tombs, and they were not granaries. And they were not shelters. They were, in the keeper's framing as rendered through Marquette's translation, places of placing. A phrase that Marquette acknowledged he found inadequate, that he spent a paragraph of his 1893 account trying to unpack. The nearest he could get was this: the structures were understood by his tradition as places where objects were placed that needed to be kept in the earth's keeping rather than in human keeping. Objects that had been brought from elsewhere. Objects whose origins were, in the keeper's account, prior to the Crow's own presence in that territory, which the keeper did not describe as contradiction or confusion. He described it as the specific reason the keeper role existed. Someone had to maintain a relationship with places that existed before the people who now lived near them. And that is the phrase I have not been able to walk away from. Places that existed before the people who now lived near them. The structures Dorsey documented in 1877 were not Crow constructions. The keeper, speaking to Marquette in 1882, was explicit about this, and apparently untroubled by it. The structures were there when the Absoluk arrived in the Bighorn Basin. The role of keeper had been established by his account of the lineage, precisely because the structures were already present and already significant and already in need of someone to tend the relationship between the living community and the things inside them. What those things were, the keeper did not say. Marquette's 1893 account notes this gap without pressing it. Either the keeper did not say, or Marquette chose not to write it down, or both. The gap is there, and it is the shape of something. This was not the only account of this kind. In 1885, 3 years after Marquette's conversation, a missionary named Elias Hewson, working in the same region, wrote a letter to the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, describing, in passing, a conversation with a Crow man who had described certain places in the foothills as being maintained by families in his community across many generations. Hewson did not understand the significance of what he was being told. He recorded it as a curious indigenous custom rather than as evidence of a structured institutional role. But his description of the practice matches Marquette's keeper account precisely. Specific families, specific places, specific prohibitions against discussing those places with outsiders, except under conditions of their own. Determining. In 1899, a geologist named Frederick Haynes, conducting a mineral survey for a private land company with interests in the Bighorn Basin, noted in his field journal, not his official report, his personal field journal, which was donated to the Wyoming State Archives by his daughter in 1947, that his Crow guide had refused, on a specific afternoon, to continue in a particular direction along a ridgeline, and had said only that some places in that country were not his to show to others. Haynes noted the refusal, accepted it, and redirected the survey. He described the ridgeline as consistent with the eastern Bighorn foothills. He did not give coordinates. I believe he understood what he had come close to. The pattern across Marquette, Hewson, and Haynes spans 22 years. 3 separate men, operating independently, in the same general territory, each encountering the same structured silence from the same category of Crow knowledge holder, each recording it in documents that were then deposited in separate archives where they have sat, unconnected to each other, for more than a century. I did not find the connection between them through any single search. I found it by following a thread from Marquette's missing bureau reports to his 1893 publication to a footnote in a 1961 archaeological survey of the Bighorn Basin that mentioned Haynes's field journal without having read Marquette, and then backward to Hewson's letter, which referenced neither of the others. 3 separate deposits, 3 separate archives, 1 story. The question the keeper asked Marquette, the question Marquette describes as having finally opened the conversation, was this: did Marquette understand the difference between knowing where a thing is and knowing what a thing is for? Marquette said he thought he did. The keeper said he was not sure any of the men who had come to ask about the stone places had understood that difference, and that this was why none of them had been answered. They wanted to know location. They wanted to know contents. They wanted to know history in the sense of chronology. None of them had asked about purpose, not the structure's original purpose, which the keeper said he did not fully know, but the purpose of maintaining them in the present, of tending a relationship with something whose origins preceded you and whose meaning you had inherited without having made. That is a form of knowledge we do not have good institutions for receiving. We have archives, and survey reports, and ethnographic field notes, and mineral survey journals. We have Dorsey's coordinates, and Marquette's deliberately obscured account, and Hewson's passing observation, and Haynes's redirected afternoon. What we do not have is the lineage itself, the names of the keepers before the keeper who spoke to Marquette, the ceremonial knowledge of what exactly was placed in those chambers, and by whom, and across what span of time, the song or prayer or procedure that a keeper performed at those structures to maintain whatever relationship the tradition required. That knowledge was held by specific people and a specific family line across what may have been a very long time. And the 19th century was not kind to specific families in specific Crow lineages. The disease years, the reservation years, the boarding school years. They did not leave much room for the careful transmission of knowledge about places you were legally prohibited from visiting, on land that had been claimed by a government that did not recognize your relationship to it as constituting any form of title. The structures are still there, or some of them are. The Bighorn Basin has been substantially developed since Dorsey's survey, and the specific ridgeline he documented in 1877 has not, to my knowledge, been formally archaeologically investigated. The stone vaults, 11 of them by his count, fitted without mortar, sealed with slabs that took 3 men to move, are either still sealed or were opened at some point after Dorsey's visit by someone who did not report the opening. The packed clay floors. The evidence of burning. Whatever was placed inside them, in the keeping of the earth. If you know someone who has walked those foothills and noticed something in the rock that didn't quite fit the landscape, share this with them. The keepers knew the difference between where a thing is and what a thing is for. We lost the second half of that knowledge before we had the sense to ask for it.